Imagine standing in the middle of a medieval battlefield. The air is thick with smoke, the ground trembles beneath the march of armored men, and the sounds of clashing steel echo all around you. For many of us today, the idea of the Middle Ages can feel distant, romanticized by films or novels, knights shining in armor, banners fluttering in the wind, and glorious victories sung about for generations. But the truth is far harsher. To find yourself on a medieval battlefield was to face an environment so brutal, so chaotic, and so unforgiving that survival was more a matter of luck than of courage or skill. The battlefield was not only a place of danger from enemy weapons, but also from exhaustion, disease, starvation, and even the betrayal of one's own failing body. Tonight, we are going to step into that world not to glorify it, but to quietly explore it, piece by piece, until the picture of what it truly meant to fight in medieval war becomes clear. And as we do, you might just find the gentle rhythm of history guiding you toward rest. Before we begin, a quick invitation. If you enjoy stories that bring the past to life in a calm and detailed way, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, History for Sleep. Subscribing helps you drift off to sleep with history each night, and it helps us grow this community of people who find peace in the echoes of the past. Also, please take a moment to leave a comment. Tell us what kinds of stories interest you the most, whether it's the daily life of ordinary villagers, the mysteries of ancient civilizations, or the hidden struggles of medieval times. And let us know when you like to listen, while winding down for bed, during a late-night study session, or even on a quiet afternoon. Your comments help us shape the kind of content that helps you relax, unwind, and explore history in the gentlest way. So settle in, get comfortable, and allow your imagination to wander back in time. Together, we'll walk the paths of soldiers, knights, and common folk who found themselves thrust into the horrors of medieval war. By the end of this journey, you may find yourself drifting off to sleep, wrapped in the calm of history's quiet telling. The battlefield was not the first danger a medieval soldier faced. Long before the clash of steel and the roar of war horses, men had to endure the long and wearying march that brought them to the fight. Picture a column of hundreds, sometimes thousands of men, walking for days or even weeks across dirt roads, muddy tracks, and open countryside. They carried heavy packs filled with what little food they could manage, along with weapons that grew heavier with every step. Boots wore through, blisters grew raw, and shoulders ached beneath the constant strain of equipment. By the time many soldiers reached the field, they were already exhausted, dehydrated, and sore, their strength drained before a single sword was drawn. For the modern listener, it is easy to forget that simply arriving at the battle was a trial that could sap away the will to fight. The march was rarely organized in the way we might imagine from films or paintings. Armies were often a loose gathering of men from different regions, pressed into service at short notice. Each group might have their own supplies, their own baggage train, and their own leaders, which meant that coordination was uneven. Some men were better provisioned than others, some better armed, and many went hungry long before the battle began. Food was a constant concern, and men often lived on stale bread, dried meat, or whatever they could forage from the countryside. Villages unlucky enough to lie in the path of an army might find their stores plundered, their fields stripped bare, and their livestock taken to feed the hungry mass of soldiers. The roads themselves added to the misery. In times of rain, dirt paths became thick with mud, sucking at boots and wagon wheels alike. Horses struggled, carts broke down, and men slipped and fell beneath the weight of their gear. In dry weather, the march kicked up choking clouds of dust that clung to sweaty faces and left mouths parched. Disease followed quickly in such conditions, as poor sanitation and close living quarters created the perfect breeding ground for illness. Dysentery, fevers, and skin infections spread swiftly through the ranks, felling men before they even caught sight of the enemy. The stench of unwashed bodies, combined with smoke from campfires and the filth of waste, filled the air during these endless marches. Sleep was scarce, and when men did rest, it was often on the cold ground with only a thin cloak or blanket to protect them from the night air. Tents were not always provided for common soldiers, and many had to huddle together for warmth, hoping the rain would not drench them by morning. The discomfort chipped away at morale, and fights sometimes broke out among the men, born of frustration, hunger, and fatigue. Yet they pushed on, driven by duty, by orders, or by fear of punishment if they faltered. The march was as much a test of endurance as the battle itself, weeding out those too weak to continue long before swords were ever drawn. For knights and wealthier soldiers, the journey was somewhat easier. They often rode on horseback, their armor and provisions carried by squires and servants. Yet even for them, the road was no comfortable place. The clatter of hooves, the ceaseless movement, and the strain of wearing armor for long periods wore them down. Horses needed constant care, and fodder for these animals was as important as food for the men themselves. Without well-fed horses, the knight's advantage in battle could vanish in an instant. The strain on logistics was immense, and entire campaigns faltered when supplies could not keep pace with the army's needs. It is also important to imagine the psychological weight of the march. Each step brought men closer to the unknown, to the looming clash where they might meet their deaths. For many, this was their first true experience of war, and the stories they had heard from veterans weighed heavily on their minds. The singing and shouting of comrades might mask the fear for a time, but in the silence of the night, doubt crept in. Some thought of their families left behind, others prayed quietly, while still others tried to drink away the dread. The march was as much about carrying the burden of fear as it was about carrying weapons and armor. Not all soldiers even made it to the battlefield. Some deserted along the way, slipping into forests or hiding in villages to escape the fate that awaited them. Desertion was a dangerous gamble, as it often meant harsh punishment if caught, yet for many, the risk seemed worth it. Others collapsed from sickness or exhaustion, left behind on the roadside or carried in wagons until they recovered, if they ever did. The attrition before battle could be staggering, meaning that armies often arrived smaller and weaker than when they had set out. The march to battle was not a brief inconvenience. It could last weeks or months, with men covering long distances across hostile or unfamiliar terrain. Rivers had to be crossed, mountains climbed, and weather endured. In hostile territory, the threat of ambush or raids was constant, and scouts rode ahead to watch for signs of the enemy. The strain of vigilance added to the burden, for an army never truly marched in peace. Even when no enemy was visible, every shadow on the horizon carried the possibility of danger. And yet, when the army finally reached its destination, there was often little time to rest. Men might be ordered to build fortifications, dig ditches, or set up camp. Leaders wanted their forces ready, and the prospect of battle could come at any hour. For the weary soldier, there was no luxury of recovery, no chance to regain strength before the fighting began. The march was simply the first chapter in the long trial of survival, and many who stumbled through it arrived at the field already broken in body and spirit. When you think about it, the medieval battlefield began not at the clash of armies, but on the very roads that led there. Every blister, every missed meal, every sleepless night, and every weary step eroded the strength of the men who would soon face death. To survive a medieval battlefield, one had to survive the march first, and that was no simple feat. If the march drained the strength of medieval soldiers, the armor they wore often finished the job. Armor is one of the most iconic images of the Middle Ages, gleaming suits of steel that seem almost indestructible in paintings, films, and legends. But the reality of wearing armor was far less glamorous. For the few who could afford full plate, it was heavy, cumbersome, and exhausting. For the many who could not, the lack of armor left them frighteningly exposed, with survival hanging by a thread in the chaos of battle. Either way, armor was not the savior it might appear to be in stories. A full suit of plate armor, the kind we often imagine on a medieval knight, could weigh anywhere from 40 to 60 pounds. This weight was not distributed evenly, but spread across the body in awkward ways. Each piece had to be strapped carefully, limiting flexibility and creating constant pressure points that bruised and rubbed the skin raw. It was possible to move in such armor, but it demanded immense stamina and practice. Soldiers often trained for years just to carry themselves in battle-ready gear without collapsing from fatigue. Now imagine not just wearing it briefly, but carrying it through hours of combat under a blazing sun or a chilling rain. The body could only endure so much before it began to falter. For the average soldier, things were much worse. Most common men had little or no access to such expensive protection. A padded gambeson, made of thick layers of quilted fabric, was the most common form of defense. It offered some cushioning against blows, but could not stop a strong sword thrust or the piercing power of an arrow. If they were lucky, a man might add a simple iron helmet or a small metal breastplate. But many went into battle with little more than their clothes, in whatever makeshift gear they could find. A wooden shield might block a strike, but it could also splinter and break under repeated blows. To stand among armored knights while dressed in mere cloth was to be a target in a deadly game. Even for knights, armor was no guarantee of safety. Arrows could pierce through weak points at the joints, crossbow bolts could punch through steel, and a heavy mace or hammer could crush the body inside even if the armor itself held firm. Heat was another enemy. Inside the steel shell, a man's body baked. Sweat-soaked clothing, eyes stung, and hands grew slippery on sword hilts. In summer, heat exhaustion or dehydration could strike just as surely as a weapon. In winter, armor chilled quickly, freezing to the skin and stiffening movement. Armor turned the body into its own prison, a shell that protected and punished at the same time. The effort of simply moving in armor was immense. Lifting a sword, raising a shield, or running across uneven ground took far more energy than it would for someone unencumbered. Soldiers tired rapidly, their muscles burning with every swing and step. The longer the battle dragged on, the more dangerous armor became, for a man too exhausted to defend himself was as good as dead. And unlike in stories where knights duel one-on-one, most medieval battles were crushing masses of men pressed together, each jostling for room to swing or push forward. Armor might stop a blade, but it could not stop the suffocation of being crushed in a wall of bodies. Then came the problem of falling. In the heat of combat, a man could be knocked down easily by a strike, a stumble, or simply by losing his balance in the chaos. Once on the ground, armor was not a friend but a trap. Rising again was difficult, especially if weighed down by plate. Enemies did not wait politely for a man to regain his footing. They swarmed quickly, plunging daggers through the gaps of armor at the armpit, groin, or throat. A fallen soldier, however strong or well protected, was often doomed. The battlefield did not forgive weakness, and armor could not protect against the merciless tide of numbers. Armor also created challenges before and after battle. Putting on a full suit was a time-consuming process that usually required assistance. Knights had squires or servants to strap every piece in place, but a common man had no such luxury. Improperly fitted armor was painful and dangerous, leaving gaps that made wounds more likely. Once the fight was over, removing armor was just as difficult, especially if the soldier was injured or too exhausted to manage. Wounded men often died simply because they could not get out of their stifling gear quickly enough to treat their injuries or cool their bodies. It is easy to think that knights, covered in metal, dominated the medieval battlefield with ease. But the truth is that armor was a constant struggle, too heavy, too hot, too expensive, and too restrictive. The vast majority of soldiers wore little more than cloth or leather, relying on sheer courage or luck to survive the storm of steel around them. For every shining night, there were hundreds of men who faced death with almost no protection at all. To be unarmored in a sea of weapons was terrifying. To be armored was exhausting and still deadly. The medieval battlefield offered no perfect choice. Wear armor, and you risked collapse from fatigue or being dragged down by your own weight. Go without it, and you stood exposed to every blade and arrow. Either way, survival was always uncertain, for armor could not shield a man from the chaos, exhaustion, or cruelty of war. The very thing that symbolized protection was often just another reason why you would not survive a medieval battlefield. When imagining the medieval battlefield, it is easy to picture two men squaring off with swords, each strike ringing out in a contest of strength and skill. Yet the reality was far more brutal and far less romantic. On a battlefield swarming with thousands of men, you would not face one opponent, but many, and the variety of weapons aimed in your direction was staggering. Each weapon was designed with one purpose: to maim, disable, or kill as efficiently as possible. To stand in the midst of such a storm was to be confronted by death in every form imaginable, whether from steel, wood, or even stone. The sword, often considered the symbol of medieval warfare, was not the most common weapon on the battlefield. While knights carried them as both tools of war and marks of status, most soldiers could not afford such finely crafted blades. Still, when swords were present, they were deadly. They were designed not only to cut, but also to thrust, sliding through the gaps in armor or stabbing deep into unprotected flesh. A skilled swordsman could turn the tide of a small skirmish, but in the chaos of mass combat, swords were often one of many dangers, not the greatest one. Far more common was the spear. Cheap to make, easy to use, and devastating in battle, the spear was the weapon of choice for countless soldiers. Spears allowed men to strike from a distance, keeping enemies at bay and pushing back cavalry charges. A wall of spear points bristling toward you would be a sight of pure terror, and if you stumbled forward into that line, there was little chance of survival. Even if a spear did not kill instantly, its long blade could pierce deeply into muscle or organ, leaving wounds that bled heavily or led to infection. Pulling a spear from the body often caused greater damage than the initial strike, and men impaled on the battlefield rarely lasted long. Axes, too, found their place in war. Many peasants pressed into service simply brought their wood-cutting axes with them, tools turned into crude instruments of destruction. Unlike swords, axes could shatter shields and bite through armor with their concentrated edge. A blow from a heavy axe could split a helmet or crush a shoulder, leaving even the strongest warrior unable to lift his weapon again. And if the blade did not finish the job, the sheer force of impact often broke bones beneath armor, leaving men crippled on the ground and unable to defend themselves. Maces and war hammers were equally terrifying. Where swords sought precision and spears offered reach, these blunt weapons relied on sheer crushing power. A knight swinging a mace could break ribs or cave in a skull, even if the armor remained intact. War hammers, with their pointed ends, were designed to puncture plate, driving through steel to the flesh beneath. Against such weapons, armor was no longer a guarantee of safety, but merely a delay in the inevitable. The weight of a single strike could leave a man dazed, disoriented, and an easy target for the next blow. And then there were arrows. Few things inspired as much fear as the sound of 1,000 bowstrings releasing at once, sending clouds of arrows arcing into the sky. Entire battles were decided by the rain of shafts that fell upon tightly packed troops, piercing armor, shields, and flesh alike. The English longbow, famous in battles such as Agincourt, could send arrows flying with enough force to pierce mail and cripple horses. Soldiers often had little warning before arrows thudded into their ranks, felling comrades left and right. Some men died instantly. Others writhed on the ground, screaming in pain with arrows lodged in their bodies. The randomness of arrows made them even more terrifying. Death could come to anyone at any moment, no matter how skilled or prepared. Crossbows were even deadlier. Though slower to reload than longbows, they packed enormous power, launching bolts with enough force to pierce thick armor. A crossbowman could level his weapon at a knight and strike him down with brutal efficiency, stripping away the advantage of wealth and status. To stand within range of crossbows was to live with the knowledge that no armor could truly protect you, and that a single unseen shot could end your life before you even swung your weapon. Other weapons added to the chaos. Halberds, with their long shafts and hooked blades, allowed soldiers to cut, thrust, and drag men from horseback. Morning stars, spiked clubs, inflicted horrific injuries, tearing flesh and shattering bone. Even stones and slings were not uncommon, especially among less trained levies. A rock hurled with enough force could crush a skull or leave a man unconscious. And in a battlefield filled with noise and confusion, such simple weapons were just as effective as the most finely crafted steel. The psychological toll of these weapons was immense. Every soldier knew that each strike had the potential to end him. The thought of being cut open by a sword, crushed by a mace, or impaled by an arrow gnawed at men long before the first clash of battle. And once the fighting began, the reality was far worse than the fear. Wounds were gruesome, blood flowed freely, and screams filled the air as weapons did their work. Survival did not depend solely on skill, but on sheer luck that the arrow would hit the man beside you. Luck that your armor would hold against the mace, luck that your shield would block the spear. To enter a medieval battlefield was to walk into a storm of weapons, each one designed to strip away your defenses and your life. There was no safety, no corner of the field untouched by danger. No matter how skilled you were, or how brave, there were too many weapons, too many enemies, and too many ways to die. Each swing, thrust, or shot increased the chances that you would not leave the field alive. And that is why the weapons you would face ensured that surviving a medieval battlefield was almost impossible. One of the least understood but most overwhelming aspects of a medieval battlefield was not the sight of weapons or the stench of blood, but the deafening noise. To step into combat was to enter a storm of sound that battered the senses from every direction. Imagine the roar of thousands of men shouting at once, the clash of metal on metal, the thunder of horses' hooves, and the blare of horns and drums meant to signal commands. Now add to that the screams of the wounded, the moans of the dying, and the cries of fear from men who realized, too late, what they had been drawn into. The battlefield was chaos incarnate, and for most who found themselves in its midst, it was disorienting to the point of terror. Noise is not just a background detail. For a soldier, the ability to hear commands, to recognize danger, or to communicate with those beside him could mean the difference between life and death. Yet in the maelstrom of battle, words were swallowed by the sheer volume of sound. Officers shouted orders, but few could hear them clearly. Drums tried to beat out rhythms. Horns tried to carry signals across the field, but even these were often lost beneath the cacophony. Confusion spread quickly as units became separated. Men misunderstood commands, and soldiers acted on instinct rather than strategy. An army could collapse not because of superior weapons, but because no one could hear or comprehend what was happening around them. For the individual soldier, the noise was terrifying. The clash of swords and axes reverberated through the air, each strike sounding like the very world was splitting apart. Horses shrieked as they reared or fell, their cries adding to the horror. Shields banged together, spears clattered, and arrows whistled through the sky before slamming into flesh with a sickening thud. Every sound carried with it the reminder of death. And unlike in training or drills, where men might learn to swing their weapons in controlled environments, nothing could prepare them for the soundscape of actual battle. It was loud enough to leave ears ringing, loud enough to shatter concentration, and loud enough to push even the bravest into panic. The psychological effect of this noise cannot be overstated. Human beings are not built to process such overwhelming sensory input. Heartbeats quickened, breathing grew ragged, and adrenaline surged as men tried to cope with the relentless roar around them. Some froze entirely, unable to move, paralyzed by the sensory overload. Others swung wildly, striking friend and foe alike in their desperation. Even veterans could be shaken by particularly fierce battles, their nerves fraying as the unending wall of sound ground down their focus and clarity. There was also the matter of constant unpredictability. Noise on the battlefield was not uniform but chaotic, rising and falling in ways that made it impossible to anticipate what might come next. One moment the cries of men might surge on your left, the next they roared on your right. You could hear a horn blaring, only to realize too late that it was the enemy's signal to charge. The whistle of arrows might come from nowhere, and by the time the sound registered, men were already dropping beside you. Each shift in sound brought a fresh jolt of fear, each new noise reminding soldiers that danger came from every angle. Modern readers might imagine that soldiers grew used to this after enough battles, but the truth was otherwise. Human nerves wear down under such stress, and even the toughest men eventually cracked. Some were left with what we might call today battle shock or trauma, their minds scarred by the memories of noise as much as by the sight of wounds. Others simply broke on the field, throwing down their weapons and fleeing, or collapsing into tears even as the fight raged on. To survive a medieval battlefield meant not only avoiding blades and arrows, but somehow enduring the endless thunder of sound without losing your grip on reality. In quieter moments, when a lull came in the fighting, the noise did not truly cease. Instead, the battlefield was filled with the groans of the injured and the screams of men calling for help. These cries carried across the field, cutting deeper into the minds of survivors than any clash of steel. To hear comrades begging for water, for mercy, or for someone to end their suffering was a torment that few could easily forget. And once the fighting resumed, the clash of weapons began again, drowning out even these voices of pain beneath its brutal symphony. The chaos and noise of battle also contributed directly to mistakes. Friendly fire, men striking their own comrades, was common. In the din, it was often impossible to hear a warning, to recognize a familiar voice, or to distinguish ally from enemy. The more chaotic the sound, the more likely men were to lash out blindly, creating as much danger for their side as for their foes. Leaders knew this, but had little power to stop it. Once the battlefield became a storm of noise, control slipped away like sand through fingers. For a modern listener, it may be tempting to think of the battlefield as silent except for the clash of weapons. But the truth is that the medieval battlefield was defined by sound. It was relentless, it was deafening, and it stripped away reason and order, leaving only raw fear and instinct behind. To survive such chaos was nearly impossible, for even if you avoided the blades and arrows, the sheer noise alone could drive you to panic, confusion, or collapse. And in a world where panic meant death, the roar of battle was just one more reason you would not last long on a medieval battlefield. Before the first sword was swung or the first arrow loosed, armies were already fighting a quieter, deadlier enemy disease. The medieval battlefield was not simply a place of violence. It was a breeding ground for illness long before the clash began. Soldiers gathered in cramped, dirty camps, often with poor sanitation and limited clean water. In such conditions, disease spread quickly, cutting men down even before they had a chance to face the enemy. For many, the most dangerous foe was not the knight charging across the field, but the invisible sickness that moved silently through the ranks. An army on the march was like a moving city. Thousands of men traveled together, eating, sleeping, and relieving themselves in the same spaces. Unlike a proper town, however, there were no reliable sewage systems or fresh wells. Waste piled up around camps, food spoiled, and streams were contaminated by both humans and animals. Dysentery, known at the time as the bloody flux, was one of the most common killers. Soldiers stricken with it suffered from severe diarrhea, dehydration, and weakness. Once it began, it spread rapidly, moving through entire units in days. Men weakened by illness could barely march, let alone fight. Some died outright, collapsing from exhaustion as their bodies gave out long before the enemy appeared. Other diseases lurked in the shadows as well. Typhus, caused by lice that thrived in the filthy clothing of soldiers, often swept through camps with devastating speed. Men broke out in fevers, rashes, and delirium, sometimes dying within a week of infection. Malaria and other fevers struck in regions with stagnant water, while respiratory illnesses spread through overcrowded tents. Even something as simple as a cold could prove deadly when combined with the exhaustion and malnutrition that plagued armies. For the medieval soldier, health was fragile, and the gathering of thousands ensured that any sickness found fertile ground to grow. Food was another culprit. Armies depended on supplies carried with them or taken from the surrounding countryside. Bread turned moldy, meat spoiled, and water went foul. Hunger pushed men to eat whatever they could find, even food already rotting. Stomach illnesses followed, leaving soldiers weak and unable to keep down meals. Weakened bodies made for easy targets, and many men who managed to stagger into battle did so with little strength to lift their weapons. To be ill was to be half dead before the first clash of steel. The lack of medical knowledge made matters worse. Medieval doctors had little understanding of germs or hygiene. Treatments often consisted of bleeding, strange potions, or superstitious charms, none of which stopped the spread of disease. Some commanders tried to maintain cleanliness in camps, ordering latrines dug or food inspected, but these efforts were inconsistent and rarely effective on a large scale. Priests sometimes marched with armies, offering prayers and blessings, but faith could do little to stop a plague once it had taken root. Soldiers often believed sickness was a punishment from God or the result of foul air, and in such confusion, little was done to contain outbreaks. The psychological toll of disease was immense. Imagine lying in camp, listening to the coughing, groaning, and retching of comrades all around you, knowing that their sickness could soon be yours. Fear spread as quickly as the illness itself, and morale withered. Men who were already frightened of the coming battle now faced the prospect of dying slowly in their tents before they ever saw the enemy. Desertion increased when disease struck, as men fled to escape both the illness and the hopelessness it brought. For those who stayed, sickness became part of the air they breathed, a constant shadow that no sword or shield could block. Even those who survived disease often carried its scars into battle. Fevers left men weak, dysentery left them dehydrated, and skin infections left them in pain. A soldier who should have stood tall and strong instead shuffled into combat already diminished, his body barely able to endure the strain of battle. Against healthy enemies, this weakness was deadly. Armies struck by disease often collapsed quickly in the field, not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked the strength to hold their ground. The commanders knew this, and yet little could be done. Disease was a constant, one of the great levelers of medieval war. A mighty army could be reduced to half its size before even seeing the enemy. Victories were sometimes won, not through brilliant tactics, but because one side managed to stay slightly healthier than the other. Kings and generals dreaded outbreaks as much as they dreaded enemy ambushes, for both could wipe out their forces in an instant. When thinking about survival on a medieval battlefield, it is easy to focus on weapons and armor, on knights and archers, on charges and duels. But long before any of that, disease stalked the camps, cutting men down quietly and relentlessly. To survive the medieval battlefield meant surviving the days and weeks beforehand, where sickness spread faster than steel and claimed more lives than the sword. And in truth, Many never even made it to the field of combat, their stories ending not with the clash of armies, but with a fevered breath in the darkness of a camp. If disease weakened medieval armies before the clash, hunger and thirst finished the job. To survive a medieval battlefield, one needed more than courage and armor. One needed the strength to lift a weapon, to march into the press of men, and to endure hour after hour of brutal fighting. But armies were rarely well fed, and water was not always safe to drink. Hunger and dehydration crept into the body like silent enemies, wearing men down until their swords felt like lead and their legs refused to carry them forward. Long before the decisive charge, the battle was already being lost inside empty stomachs and parched throats. Supplying food for thousands of men was a near impossible task in the Middle Ages. There were no modern supply trucks, no refrigeration, and no canned goods to keep armies nourished. Instead, men marched with sacks of bread, dried meat, cheese, or whatever provisions their commanders could gather. These supplies rarely lasted long, and once consumed, the army relied heavily on foraging or outright looting. Villages along the route often suffered, stripped of grain, livestock, and ale to feed the hungry horde. Yet even with such desperate measures, there was never enough to go around. Soldiers frequently went days with little more than crusts of stale bread or thin broth, their bodies slowly weakening under the constant strain. Hunger in itself was not merely uncomfortable. It was deadly. Malnourished soldiers lacked the energy needed to fight effectively. Their muscles cramped, their focus dulled, and their reaction times slowed. A man on an empty stomach swung his sword sluggishly, raised his shield too late, or stumbled at the crucial moment. On a battlefield where survival often came down to fractions of a second, hunger robbed men of the sharpness they needed to live. The enemy did not need to kill them outright. Starvation was already doing the work. Water, too, was a constant problem. Armies needed rivers, streams, or wells to sustain thousands of thirsty men, as well as their horses. But not all water was safe to drink. Streams were easily fouled by waste, carcasses, or the simple passage of so many men. Soldiers often drank from muddy pools or stagnant ditches out of desperation, and in doing so swallowed illness along with water. Dysentery, cholera-like infections, and fever spread from such sources, ensuring that thirst was not only painful, but often lethal. Yet men could not fight without water, and so they drank whatever they found, accepting the risk because the alternative was collapse. Imagine standing on the battlefield, the sun beating down, your throat cracked and dry. The heat of armor baked the body, sweat pouring until your clothing clung heavy and damp. Every breath felt like fire, every step like wading through thick mud. Your lips split, your tongue swelled, and your mind clouded with dizziness. This was the reality of dehydration in combat. Soldiers often fainted or stumbled from exhaustion, easy prey for the enemy's weapons. Even the strongest knight, clad in plate, could be undone by thirst faster than by sword. The problem of hunger and thirst was not confined to long marches or summer campaigns. Winter brought its own challenges, with supplies running low as the land offered little food. Armies that could not find sustenance were forced to scatter, disband, or turn back, sometimes without ever meeting the enemy. Hunger gnawed at discipline, sparking arguments and even mutiny in the ranks. Men too weak to march abandoned their comrades, falling behind and often dying alone on the roadside. In this way, hunger was not just a personal enemy, but a destroyer of entire armies. Commanders struggled constantly with logistics, for no matter how skilled their tactics, an army that lacked food and water could not fight. Some leaders stockpiled supplies, building great wagons of bread and ale, but these were slow-moving targets for raiders and ambushes. Others relied on swift campaigns, striking quickly before starvation set in. Yet even the best-planned army eventually faced shortages, for medieval warfare was a slow, grinding affair that often dragged on for months. The longer the campaign, the hungrier the soldiers, and the less chance they had of survival when the decisive battle finally came. The psychological toll of hunger and thirst was profound. A man who had not eaten properly in days found it difficult to care about honor, loyalty, or strategy. His world narrowed to the gnawing emptiness in his stomach and the aching dryness in his throat. Morale plummeted as men grew too weak to laugh, sing, or even talk. Comrades began to eye one another with quiet despair, knowing that the enemy was not their only obstacle. Some soldiers resorted to desperate measures, eating grass, bark, or whatever scraps they could find. Others stole from their fellow men, creating mistrust and conflict within the army itself. On the battlefield itself, hunger and thirst sealed many fates. Men who should have stood firm broke ranks and fled, too weak to withstand a charge. Others collapsed outright, their bodies failing under the strain. In the chaos of battle, there was no room for weakness. An enemy soldier did not pause to consider whether his opponent had eaten in days. He struck without mercy. For every man felled by sword or arrow, there were others whose doom had already been written, by starvation and thirst long before the fighting began. It is tempting to think that war is decided by strength of arms, by the courage of knights, or the brilliance of generals. Yet in truth, hunger and thirst were often the most decisive forces of all. An army fed and watered could fight. An army weakened by deprivation could not. To step onto a medieval battlefield already half-starved and dehydrated was to step into death's embrace. The enemy need not strike you down. Your own body had already begun to betray you. And that is why, in the grim reality of medieval warfare, hunger and dehydration were as lethal as any weapon you might face. Few experiences on a medieval battlefield could inspire such raw, instinctive terror as the thunder of a cavalry charge. To stand on foot while mounted knights bore down on you was to feel the ground shake beneath your boots, to hear the earth rumble like a storm, and to see a wall of steel and horseflesh rushing closer with unstoppable force. Cavalry charges were not simply attacks. They were spectacles of intimidation and destruction designed to shatter both the bodies and the spirits of enemy soldiers. For those caught in their path, survival was often little more than a desperate hope. The horse itself was as much a weapon as the knight who rode it. War horses were massive beasts, bred and trained for strength, discipline, and aggression. They were not the fragile animals of farmyards, but powerful chargers capable of trampling men underfoot, breaking bones, and scattering ranks like straw in the wind. These horses were trained to ignore the chaos of battle, the clash of weapons, the screams of dying men, and the roar of drums and horns. They charged forward without hesitation, guided by riders who had spent years mastering the art of mounted combat. Facing such beasts, even the bravest foot soldier felt the instinctive fear of prey before a predator. For the knight atop the horse, the charge was both a display of dominance and a deadly tactic. Armed with a lance, the rider lowered the weapon into position as the horse reached full speed. The momentum of horse and rider together turned the lance into a spear of devastating power. A single impact could impale a man, lift him off the ground, or drive through shield and armor alike. Even if the lance shattered on impact, the force was often enough to knock a man sprawling, leaving him helpless before the rest of the cavalry trampled past. The sheer kinetic energy of the charge made it one of the deadliest weapons of a medieval battlefield. The psychological effect of cavalry charges was often greater than the physical damage. Imagine standing in a line of infantry, shield raised, as the sound of hooves grew louder and louder. The sight of glinting armor, lowered lances, and war banners snapping in the wind filled the air with dread. Many men broke ranks before the horses even arrived, throwing down their weapons and fleeing in panic. Once a line began to falter, the cavalry easily tore through the gaps, scattering survivors and turning what might have been a defensive stand into a rout. Fear alone was often enough to hand victory to the mounted knights. Defending against cavalry was possible, but required immense discipline. Infantry had to form tight ranks, often with long spears or pikes bristling outward like a hedge of steel. Only by presenting an unbroken wall could foot soldiers hope to repel the charge. But discipline was fragile in the chaos of battle. If even a few men faltered, the line collapsed and the cavalry streamed through like water through a broken dam. To stand your ground as horses thundered closer demanded nerves of iron, something few soldiers possessed after hours of fighting, hunger, and exhaustion. Even those who managed to withstand the first impact were not safe. After the lances broke, knights drew swords, axes, or maces, slashing and striking down at men below. Mounted high above, they had reach and momentum on their side. A swing from horseback carried far greater force than one on foot, and soldiers often fell before they could even lift their shields. Horses themselves kicked and bit, striking out at those who came too close. The charge was not a single blow, but a rolling wave of destruction, breaking apart ranks and leaving chaos in its wake. For those trampled beneath the charge, the experience was nightmarish. A fallen soldier had little chance of rising again as hooves pounded the earth around him. Bones snapped, lungs were crushed, and bodies were ground into the mud. Even if death did not come instantly, the weight of men and horses rushing overhead often left survivors broken and helpless. No rescue was possible in the press of bodies. The wounded were left behind as the tide of battle surged on. Cavalry also brought unpredictability. Knights could sweep in from the flanks, circling around to strike at the rear where men were less prepared. They could charge repeatedly, retreating to regroup before surging forward again, each attack sapping the strength and morale of their enemies. To face one cavalry charge was daunting enough. To withstand several in succession tested even the hardiest armies. Each thunderous advance drove home the reality that survival was slipping further out of reach. It is important to remember that not every soldier on the battlefield had armor strong enough to withstand the blow of a lance or the crush of a horse. Many foot soldiers wore only padded cloth or simple leather, offering little protection. Against the momentum of a charging knight, such defenses might as well have been paper. The rich and powerful, mounted on their steeds, cut through the poor and powerless with brutal efficiency. The imbalance was stark, and for those on the ground, it meant death came swiftly and often without the chance to fight back. Even after the chaos of a charge subsided, the damage lingered. Broken lines were nearly impossible to reform under pressure, and panic spread quickly among survivors. Men who had once stood together now found themselves isolated, surrounded, or scattered across the field. In such disarray, even lightly armed enemies could finish what the cavalry had begun. The charge was not just a weapon of destruction, but a weapon of disruption, tearing apart the cohesion that armies depended on for survival. To stand against a medieval cavalry charge was to pit human flesh against thunder, speed, and steel. Few had the courage, fewer still had the strength, and many had neither. The battlefield became a place where survival was not a matter of skill alone, but of withstanding a force designed to crush both body and spirit. For the ordinary soldier, the sight of mounted knights hurtling forward was not simply frightening. It was the moment he realized he might not leave the battlefield alive. If the thunder of cavalry was terrifying, then the silent rain of arrows was no less deadly. On a medieval battlefield, soldiers often faced death long before they reached sword's reach of the enemy. Archers and crossbowmen stood at the edges of the fight, sending volleys of missiles arcing high into the sky. Thousands of shafts darkened the heavens at once, blotting out the sun before descending with terrifying speed. You could not parry them. You could not fight back. All you could do was pray that the arrows did not find you in the sea of targets below. Archers were among the most feared soldiers in the medieval world, particularly the famed longbowmen of England. The longbow was a weapon of immense power, requiring years of training to master. The draw strength alone was enough to strain even the strongest arms. Yet skilled archers could release arrows with astonishing speed, creating near-constant storms of death. A well-aimed arrow could pierce chainmail, slip between plates of armor, or fell a horse in mid-charge. For lightly armed infantry, the chances of survival under a rain of arrows were slim. Even those who wore helmets and shields were not safe, as shafts found gaps or struck unprotected limbs. The crossbow was even deadlier in some respects. Unlike the longbow, it required less training to use effectively, allowing common soldiers to wield devastating power. A crossbow bolt, launched from its mechanism, could punch through armor that a longbow struggled to pierce, making even knights vulnerable. Though slower to reload, crossbows allowed entire ranks of soldiers to fire volleys in rotation, creating a steady rhythm of destruction. To face crossbowmen was to stand in a killing field, where any step forward brought the risk of being struck down. What made archers and crossbowmen so frightening was their distance. A man might steel himself to face an enemy in hand-to-hand combat, drawing strength from the sight of his foe. But against arrows, there was nothing to see except the brief glint in the sky before impact. Death came without warning, often from hundreds of yards away, long before the enemy was visible. Men fell beside you in an instant, struck in the neck, chest, or thigh. Some died immediately. Others writhed on the ground, clutching at the shafts that protruded grotesquely from their bodies. Each fall chipped away at the courage of those still standing, until whole lines faltered beneath the invisible storm. The sound of arrows was a constant terror. They whistled as they cut through the air, then struck with sickening thuds into flesh, wood, or earth. Shields quivered under the impact, helmets rang, and the cries of the wounded echoed across the field. The randomness of it all was perhaps the worst part. A soldier could do everything right: hold his shield high, crouch low, keep in formation, and still find himself struck by the arrow meant for someone else. Survival was a lottery, and the fear of chance wore heavily on the mind. Defenses against archers existed, but they were imperfect. Shields were raised, but no shield could protect the entire body. Armor offered some protection, but joints and gaps were always vulnerable. Some armies carried large wooden pavises, portable walls that men crouched behind, but these slowed movement and offered little help once the melee began. Horses were particularly vulnerable, and knights who relied on their steeds often found themselves stranded on foot once arrows tore through their mounts. Even if the knight survived, losing a horse in the midst of combat left him exposed and at the mercy of enemies on every side. Archers also worked hand in hand with other arms of the military. A storm of arrows softened enemy lines before cavalry charges or infantry assaults, leaving men wounded, scattered, or already dead before the main clash. This combination of ranged and close combat was devastating, ensuring that soldiers rarely reached the enemy unscathed. By the time swords and spears clashed, many men were already bleeding, exhausted, or too frightened to fight effectively. The battle had been lost before it began, thanks to the deadly efficiency of archers and crossbowmen. The psychological effect of standing under an arrow storm was crippling. Men crouched low, clutching shields, their hearts pounding as the sky darkened above. They knew that the next sound, the whistle, the snap, the thud, might mean the end. Morale withered quickly under such conditions. Soldiers prayed, cursed, or froze, some breaking and fleeing before ever seeing the enemy. Commanders shouted for discipline, but fear spread like fire. It was one thing to fight a visible foe. It was another to endure a faceless, relentless rain of death from above. Injuries from arrows were particularly gruesome. A shaft lodged in the body was difficult to remove without proper tools, and many men died slowly from infection or blood loss. Arrows that pierced through joints crippled limbs, rendering men useless even if they survived. The battlefield became littered with writhing, screaming men, their bodies punctured like grotesque pin cushions. The sight alone was enough to shatter the will of those still standing. For the common soldier, archers and crossbowmen represented a nightmare without escape. There was no bravery that could stop an arrow, no courage that could deflect a bolt. Death came from a distance, impersonal and merciless, striking down rich and poor alike. To survive a medieval battlefield meant first surviving the storm of arrows, and for many, that was where their story ended. The truth of the medieval battlefield was that archers and crossbowmen ruled from afar, deciding battles before swords were crossed. And for those caught beneath their relentless volleys, survival was a fragile hope, snatched away by a whisper in the wind and the sharp bite of steel from the sky. When we think of the medieval battlefield, we often imagine the clash of steel, the banners flying, and the cries of men locked in heroic struggle. What is harder to picture, and nearly impossible to endure, is the suffocating physical heat of battle itself. Not just the warmth of the sun on armor, but the sweltering, choking furnace created when thousands of men pressed together in combat, their bodies and breath mixing into a heavy, stifling fog of exhaustion. It was a heat that stole air from the lungs, blurred vision, and turned every movement into agony. For many soldiers, the heat of combat was as deadly as the weapons themselves. The first source of this heat came from armor. Imagine yourself wrapped in thick padded clothing, perhaps a gambeson quilted with multiple layers of linen or wool. Over this, you wear chainmail or plates of steel, each piece covering you like a sealed shell. Then add a helmet, its narrow slits restricting airflow, trapping breath and sweat inside. From the moment you donned this armor, your body became a furnace. Heat built with every step, every swing, and every desperate gasp for air. Sweat soaked your clothing, pooling beneath the armor, stinging your eyes, and slipping down your face. Armor may have kept blades at bay for a time, but it baked the body until fatigue and heat exhaustion took over. Then there was the heat generated by the mass of men. A battlefield was no open space where warriors fought neatly spaced duels. It was a crush of bodies packed shoulder to shoulder, each man pushing forward, straining, jostling, and heaving against his enemies. The breath of hundreds mingled in suffocating clouds, and the warmth of so many bodies radiated outward like the walls of a burning building. For those trapped in the press, it felt as though the air itself was being stolen away. Breathing grew shallow, desperate, and ragged. Some men fainted where they stood, unable to draw enough oxygen to fuel their straining muscles. The weapons themselves added to the misery. The act of swinging a sword, hefting a spear, or thrusting a pike demanded tremendous energy. Muscles burned with lactic acid, arms grew heavy, and lungs screamed for air. Fighting was not a few moments of choreographed strikes, but minutes and hours of relentless strain. Each blow came slower than the last, each parry weaker, until exhaustion left a man wide open to death. Even the strongest fighters could not maintain their strength indefinitely, and as their bodies failed, the heat pressed down harder, as if the battlefield itself were conspiring against them. The sun was another enemy. Many battles were fought in summer, under skies that offered no relief. Helmets turned into ovens beneath the noon glare, and soldiers baked beneath layers of steel and wool. The ground itself reflected heat upward, and the stench of sweat, blood, and rotting waste thickened in the sweltering air. Flies swarmed, drawn to the sweat and open wounds, adding torment to exhaustion. In such conditions, dehydration struck quickly, leaving soldiers dizzy, nauseated, and stumbling. A man could die with no sword touching him, simply collapsing from the combined weight of heat and exhaustion. Yet even in winter, the heat of combat did not vanish. The press of men still created suffocation, and the effort of fighting still generated sweat. In freezing weather, this sweat became another hazard. Clothing drenched in moisture stiffened and froze, chilling the body and weakening it further. A man might emerge from combat shivering, his body trembling uncontrollably, even as the fight raged on around him. The battlefield punished in every season, with heat and cold conspiring equally against survival. The psychological toll of heat was immense. As exhaustion set in, men grew sluggish, their thoughts clouded, their willpower drained. Panic set in when they could not breathe properly, when helmets felt like cages and armor like coffins. Some tore off pieces of gear in desperation, exposing themselves to enemy blades just for a breath of air. Others collapsed where they stood, trampled by comrades or cut down by enemies who pressed forward without pause. The heat did not simply sap strength, it shattered the spirit, leaving men unable to resist even when survival demanded it. Commanders knew the danger of exhaustion, but there was little they could do. Battles did not pause, so men could rest and cool themselves. Once the lines clashed, the struggle was continuous, relentless, and unforgiving. Some armies attempted to rotate their front ranks, pulling weary men back and replacing them with fresher ones. But in the chaos of real combat, such neat maneuvers often failed. Once a soldier entered the press, he had to endure until the tide of battle shifted, or until he fell. The battlefield became a place where time stretched cruelly. Minutes felt like hours, every heartbeat a struggle against heat and exhaustion. To those trapped in the center of the melee, there was no escape, no chance to step aside or draw breath. Men pushed from behind, enemies pressed from ahead, and the walls of bodies closed in from every side. Survival meant enduring the furnace as much as it meant parrying the blade. And for many, the heat of combat proved too great an enemy. The medieval battlefield killed with sword and spear, but it also killed with suffocation, exhaustion, and heat. It drained the life from soldiers slowly, stealing their strength until they could no longer lift their weapons or even hold themselves upright. To survive, one needed more than bravery or skill. One needed a body of iron, a mind of stone, and the impossible luck to stand where the heat did not overwhelm. Yet few possessed such fortune. And that is why, for so many, the battlefield was not just about facing enemies. It was about fighting against their own failing bodies as the furnace of war consumed them. When we imagine battles of the Middle Ages, we tend to see them on open fields, the kind of neat, grassy plains painted in illuminated manuscripts or described in later ballads. But the truth was far different. The medieval battlefield was often a miserable, uneven, and treacherous landscape. Mud, stones, ditches, rivers, and hills turned every step into a hazard. Soldiers did not fight on carefully chosen arenas. They fought where commanders could meet and where armies happened to collide. That meant the terrain itself became one of the greatest enemies, as deadly as the blades and arrows flying through the air. Mud was perhaps the most infamous of these dangers. Rain turned dirt fields into sucking bogs, dragging at boots, and wheels swallowing horses up to their bellies and pulling men down when they needed to move quickly. Imagine trying to run while carrying a heavy spear or wearing armor that already weighed dozens of pounds, only to feel your feet caught with every step. Many soldiers slipped, fell, and could not rise again, especially when pressed by crowds surging forward or backward in panic. A man on the ground was an easy target, but often he did not even live long enough to be struck. He was trampled, suffocated, or drowned in shallow muck as the crush of men pinned him down. The terrain also shaped the way armies fought. Marshes and boggy ground made cavalry charges almost useless, leaving knights stranded and vulnerable. Forests broke up formations, making it impossible to maintain tight lines. Rocky hills left men stumbling and uneven, their ranks scattered before the enemy could even strike. And rivers or ditches created deadly traps, where men were forced to cross while under fire from archers, or where panicked soldiers drowned in their rush to escape. Many medieval commanders tried to choose ground that favored their forces, but they could not always control the weather or the land. Soldiers paid the price for poor footing with their lives. Even dry ground brought hazards. Thick dust rose in summer, choking lungs, blinding eyes, and turning the air into a suffocating haze. Soldiers stumbled into one another, disoriented by the swirling clouds, unable to see the enemy's approach. Horses, too, struggled in such conditions, their hooves slipping on loose stones, their riders thrown in the chaos. Hills forced armies to fight uphill or downhill, each step adding strain to already weary legs. Fighting uphill was exhausting. Fighting downhill risked losing control, stumbling forward into the enemy's blades. No matter the direction, the land itself took its toll. Bodies on the ground created another layer of terrain. As men fell, their corpses piled up, turning the battlefield into a grotesque obstacle course. Soldiers tripped over the dead and the dying, their feet slicked by mud mixed with blood. Wounded men crawled beneath the crush of feet, pulling at ankles in desperation, dragging others down with them. The ground grew so treacherous that even surviving the fight's first minutes did not guarantee footing later. Many battles ended with heaps of men entangled on the ground, unable to rise, buried beneath comrades, friends, and foes alike. The stench of the battlefield only added to the misery. Mud mingled with waste, with blood, and with the rot of food and animals. Soldiers gagged as they fought, their bodies revolting against the air they breathed. For some, the effort of fighting while struggling against terrain and foul smells was simply too much. They collapsed from exhaustion or sickness, victims of the land as much as of the enemy. The terrain also gave enemies opportunities to exploit weakness. Archers took high ground where their arrows could rain down more effectively. Cavalry searched for firm soil where they could ride at full charge, cutting down those bogged in mud. Infantry pressed men into ditches and streams, where armor weighed them down until they drowned. Even when a soldier thought he had his footing, the land betrayed him. Every step demanded energy. Every stumble risked death. The unpredictability of terrain made fear worse. A soldier never knew if the ground beneath him would hold firm or turn treacherous. The sudden shock of slipping could throw a man into panic, and panic spread quickly through ranks. A stumble in the wrong place might open a gap, and gaps invited disaster. More than one army broke, not because of superior weapons, but because the land itself turned against them, pulling down their men in critical moments. For the common soldier, terrain was yet another obstacle stacked against survival. He had already marched for days, already starved and thirsted, already felt the weight of armor and the terror of arrows. Now, even the ground beneath his feet became an enemy. Every step threatened to send him sprawling. Every ditch threatened to swallow him whole. Even the weather seemed to conspire against him, turning the earth to mud or dust, making survival less about courage and more about sheer luck. The truth is that the medieval battlefield was not a clean stage for noble combat. It was a treacherous, shifting, unpredictable place where the land itself worked hand in hand with hunger, exhaustion, and fear to destroy men. To survive the enemy was hard enough. To survive the battlefield itself was harder still. Mud, rivers, rocks, and hills all played their part in claiming lives, ensuring that no man could ever truly feel secure on the ground beneath him. And that is why, even before a sword struck home, many soldiers were already lost, swallowed by the battlefield itself. On a medieval battlefield, enemies were not the only danger. In the chaos of combat, confusion reigned supreme, and soldiers often found themselves striking down comrades rather than foes. Friendly fire was not some rare accident, it was an everyday reality. With dust swirling, blood blinding, and noise drowning out all sense of direction, men lost track of who was beside them, who was behind them, and who was coming at them from the other side. Confusion became its own weapon, and it often proved as deadly as the swords and arrows of the enemy. Imagine a battlefield packed with thousands of men. Each wore armor and carried weapons, but there were no neat uniforms to distinguish one side from another. Colors and banners helped commanders identify units from a distance, but in the crush of close combat, such markers became meaningless. A man might see only a blur of steel, sweat, and mud. In the panic, the difference between friend and foe vanished. Soldiers lashed out at anything that moved, striking with all their might in the desperate hope of surviving a few moments longer. Many men died not from enemy blades, but from the frantic blows of their own allies. The problem was worse when archers and crossbowmen entered the field. Volleys of arrows, loosed at long range, often fell upon comrades just as easily as upon enemies. A sudden shift in wind or an unexpected movement of troops could send arrows raining down on friendly ranks. Commanders tried to time their archery with precision, but precision was difficult when the battlefield seethed with unpredictable movement. Men cursed the arrows that fell from behind as much as the ones that came from ahead, never knowing whether death would come from the enemy or from their own side's bowstrings. Confusion also spread through shouted commands. In the din of battle, voices carried poorly, and men often misheard or misunderstood their officers. A call to advance could be taken as a call to retreat. An order to hold could be drowned out entirely. Once a few men moved in the wrong direction, panic spread like wildfire. Soldiers fled when they should have fought, charged when they should have held, or stood idle as the enemy swept over them. Miscommunication turned strong positions into disasters, and armies crumbled not from superior tactics, but from the sheer inability to make themselves heard in the storm of sound. Smoke and dust made matters worse. Arrows striking shields, horses pounding the earth, fires breaking out in villages or fields nearby, all of it filled the air with choking haze. Visibility shrank until men could barely see beyond the reach of their weapons. Strikes fell blindly, shields were raised against shadows, and men stumbled into one another with no sense of direction. Entire formations dissolved in the confusion, leaving soldiers fighting in scattered knots, each unsure whether the man beside him was ally or foe. Even banners and heraldry, meant to prevent such chaos, often failed. Coats of arms were difficult to see in the melee, smeared with mud and blood. Flags might fall in the press, their bearers trampled before replacements could be raised. And when armies spoke different languages or dialects, confusion deepened further. Cries for help went unanswered, and warnings went unheeded. Soldiers fought in isolation, each group believing itself abandoned, even while allies stood only a short distance away. Friendly fire and confusion were not only immediate dangers. They also eroded morale. Soldiers who saw their comrades struck down by their own side lost faith in their leaders and their army's cohesion. The fear of being betrayed by confusion gnawed at their nerves, making them hesitant, slower, and more likely to falter. Trust frayed, and once trust was gone, discipline collapsed. Armies turned into mobs, their strength undone not by the enemy, but by themselves. To add to the horror, confusion often lingered after battles were done. In the darkness of night, in the haze of retreat, soldiers continued to strike one another by mistake. Wounded men crawling for safety were cut down by their own side, mistaken for enemies. Survivors staggered back to camp, only to be killed by comrades too fearful to check identities before striking. In such moments, the battlefield seemed to consume itself, devouring friend and foe alike in an orgy of chaos. For the common soldier, confusion meant that there was no safe direction. Turning left or right could bring you face to face with an enemy or with a comrade whose panicked strike would end your life just the same. Every shout was suspect, every movement a threat. There was no clear line, no simple boundary between safety and danger. The medieval battlefield was not a chessboard of neat moves, but a storm of uncertainty. And in that storm, men often perished by the hands of those meant to protect them. Survival was never guaranteed, even among allies. The sword you trusted to defend you might just as easily strike you down. The arrow loosed to weaken the enemy might find its mark in your back. The order shouted to save your life might be misunderstood and doom you instead. And that is why, on a medieval battlefield, confusion and friendly fire were not accidents. They were inevitabilities, as deadly and unrelenting as any weapon in the hands of the enemy. In the modern world, a soldier wounded on the battlefield has a chance at survival thanks to rapid evacuation, sterile bandages, antibiotics, and surgery. But in the Middle Ages, a wound was almost always a death sentence, whether immediate or delayed. To be struck by sword, arrow, spear, or mace was not only to suffer the agony of the injury itself, but also to face the grim reality of having little to no medical care. Even minor wounds festered into life-ending infections, and the battlefield was littered not only with the dead, but with the slowly dying men who suffered for hours or days, abandoned to fate because medicine could offer them nothing. The brutality of medieval weapons meant that wounds were rarely clean. A sword might slash deeply through flesh, exposing bone and muscle. A spear could punch through the torso, leaving gaping holes that bled uncontrollably. Arrows often broke upon entry, leaving splintered shafts and barbed heads lodged deep inside the body. Blunt weapons shattered bones, ruptured organs, and crushed skulls. These injuries were horrific on their own, but the filth of the battlefield made them far worse. Mud, dirt, sweat, and blood soaked into every cut, carrying bacteria that soldiers and physicians of the time did not even know existed. The smallest infection could grow into raging fever, swelling, and sepsis, killing a man days or even weeks after the battle. Medical knowledge was limited. The theory of germs had not yet been discovered, and treatments were based on superstition, trial and error, or the ancient teachings of Galen and Hippocrates, which were often misunderstood. Physicians and barber surgeons tried to balance the humors of the body blood. Phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile believing illness came from imbalance rather than infection. Their methods included bleeding, purging, or applying strange poultices made of herbs, animal fat, or even dung. While some herbal remedies might soothe pain or reduce swelling, few actually cured wounds. In many cases, the treatments themselves made matters worse, introducing more contamination into already dangerous injuries. Surgery was crude and terrifying. Without anesthesia, men endured amputations, cauterizations, or crude attempts to remove arrowheads while fully conscious. Soldiers were held down by comrades as knives sawed through flesh and bone, their screams echoing across camps. Some survived the shock, but many died of blood loss or infection soon after. Cauterization with red-hot irons was common to stop bleeding, but it often left terrible burns and rarely saved the patient in the long term. For many wounded soldiers, death came slowly, as they lay writhing in agony with no hope of proper treatment. The conditions of the battlefield only worsened survival odds. There were no clean hospitals waiting to receive the wounded, only tents, barns, or the open ground itself. Soldiers were dragged from the field, bleeding heavily, and left among piles of other injured men. The air reeked of blood and decay. Flies swarmed to feast on open wounds, and rats scurried through camps at night. The groans of the injured filled the air for hours or days after the battle, a grim reminder that even survival in the moment of combat did not guarantee safety afterward. Water, often polluted, was used to wash wounds, spreading infection rather than cleansing it. Bandages were scarce, and men often wrapped injuries with dirty cloths torn from their own clothing. The lack of proper sanitation meant that even scratches could turn lethal. Soldiers who might otherwise have healed with rest often developed gangrene, their flesh blackening and rotting until amputation became the only option, and often even that came too late. Psychologically, the fear of being wounded was as great as the fear of being killed outright. Soldiers knew that an arrow to the leg or a sword to the arm might not kill them immediately, but it condemned them to agony and near-certain death later. Many men preferred a quick death in combat to the slow, torturous decline of untreated wounds. Some begged comrades to finish them off, asking for mercy killings rather than face the inevitable rot of infection. Mercy was not always given, but when it was often seen as an act of grim kindness. The nobility sometimes fared slightly better, but not much. Wealthier knights might be tended to by more skilled physicians, but even the best knowledge of the time was woefully inadequate. A knight with a pierced lung or a crushed skull had no greater chance of survival than a peasant. Rank might bring cleaner lodgings, but it could not stop infection or blood loss. The battlefield was a place where steel did not discriminate, and medicine was powerless to save those struck down. The aftermath of wounds also destroyed lives even when men survived. Crippling injuries left soldiers maimed, missing limbs, blinded, or permanently disabled. These men returned home not as heroes, but as burdens, unable to work their fields or support their families. The physical scars were accompanied by lifelong pain, infections that returned again and again, and psychological torment. Survival, in many cases, was merely the beginning of another kind of suffering. When we look back at medieval warfare, it is tempting to focus on the immediate violence of combat. But the grim truth is that wounds were often worse than death. They condemned men to agony, stripped away their dignity, and left them helpless in a world that had little to offer in the way of care. To survive a medieval battlefield was to carry wounds that could kill you days later, or that could leave you broken for the rest of your life. And for the vast majority, the absence of real medicine meant that the moment steel met flesh, their fate was already sealed. The clashing swords, the thunder of hooves, the arrows raining down, all of these were horrors enough. But perhaps the most devastating and enduring enemy on a medieval battlefield was not physical at all. It was the weight of the mind, the crushing burden of fear, despair, and trauma. While we often imagine knights and soldiers as hardened, fearless men, the truth is that the psychological toll of war was immense. Many men broke under its pressure, and even those who survived carried invisible wounds long after the fighting was done. From the moment a man was called to arms, the mental strain began. The march to battle was filled with uncertainty. Every step brought him closer to the possibility of death. Around campfires at night, soldiers whispered of what awaited them, of arrows piercing through armor, of comrades trampled beneath horses, of men screaming in agony with wounds that never healed. These stories spread quickly, and fear dug deep roots before the first enemy was even in sight. Some men tried to laugh, to boast, to drink away the dread, but deep down they knew that courage could not silence the gnawing awareness of what lay ahead. When the fighting began, fear surged into terror. The battlefield was a place of confusion, where friends vanished in the press of bodies and enemies appeared from nowhere. Every whistle of an arrow, every clang of steel, every scream reminded a soldier that his own end might be seconds away. The mind reeled under the constant threat, unable to process the endless stream of horror. Some men froze in place, paralyzed by dread, unable to raise their shields or strike their foes. Others lashed out wildly, their blows uncontrolled, driven more by panic than skill. In the chaos of combat, fear turned men into victims long before any weapon struck them. The brutality of sights and sounds only deepened the toll. Imagine looking around and seeing the ground littered with bodies, many of them friends you had marched beside for weeks. Men torn apart by weapons, their faces unrecognizable, their blood soaking into the mud. Others screaming for water, begging for help, their voices raw with pain. Horses shrieking as they collapsed, their riders crushed beneath them. The human mind recoiled from such images, and yet soldiers had no choice but to witness them again and again. Each moment seared itself into memory, a brand that could never be erased. Even when a soldier survived, the memories followed him. Long after the battle ended, long after he returned home, he might still hear the screams in his dreams. We know today the term post-traumatic stress, but medieval men had no such name for it. They simply carried their torment silently, plagued by nightmares, sudden fits of rage, or long silences that no one could understand. Some became withdrawn, unable to speak of what they had seen. Others turned to drink or violence, their lives unraveling as their minds struggled to cope with the ghosts of the battlefield. Survival did not mean escape. It meant living with a wound that never healed. The psychological toll was not only individual. It affected entire armies. Panic could sweep through ranks like wildfire. If one man fled, his fear infected others, and soon a whole unit might collapse. Fear was contagious, more dangerous than disease, more destructive than hunger. Commanders tried to maintain order with discipline, with oaths, with the promise of honor, or the threat of punishment. Yet no promise, no threat, could fully suppress the instinct to run when faced with overwhelming terror. Many battles were lost not because of superior strategy, but because fear unstrung the hearts of men. The burden was heavier still for commanders. Leaders bore the responsibility not only of their own survival, but of the lives of thousands. They watched as men under their command were cut down, knowing their decisions had led them into slaughter. Victories brought glory, but also the haunting knowledge of the cost. Defeats brought shame, often accompanied by exile or execution. The psychological toll of leadership was its own torment, different but no less destructive than that faced by common soldiers. Religion offered some comfort, but it also deepened fear. Many soldiers believed that dying in battle might earn them salvation, yet they also feared damnation for sins committed in life. Priests walked among the ranks, blessing men before they marched, urging them to be brave, promising that God was on their side. But on the battlefield, as blood soaked the ground and comrades writhed in agony, it was difficult to believe that divine favor rested upon them. The clash between faith and the horrors of reality left many men spiritually shattered, their confidence in God as shaken as their faith in survival. For families back home, the psychological toll lingered in silence. Survivors returned changed, haunted by what they had seen. Some could not speak of it, retreating into quiet despair. Others lashed out, their violence spilling into households and villages. Children grew up with fathers, broken not in body but in spirit, carrying the unspoken weight of wars they never understood. The battlefield claimed not only the lives of the dead, but the peace of the living who carried its memories. To survive the weapons of a medieval battlefield was one challenge. To survive the toll it took on the mind was another. Many men could not endure either. Those who did often found that life after war was a prison of memory, a place where the cries of comrades and the sight of death returned again and again. The medieval battlefield did not end when the fighting stopped. It lived on in the minds of those who survived, ensuring that no man truly left it behind. When we think of surrender today, we picture soldiers laying down their arms and being taken into custody with at least the hope of survival. But on a medieval battlefield, surrender was far from a guarantee of safety. The fate of prisoners was uncertain, often depending on the mood of the victors, the rank of the captured, or even the simple whim of chance. Mercy was rare, brutality was common, and for most men, capture offered little more than a slower, crueler end than death in combat. For knights and nobles, the situation was somewhat different. They were valuable, not as comrades spared out of chivalry, but as commodities. Capturing a nobleman meant ransom, and ransom could bring immense wealth. A knight taken alive might be held in relative comfort, while his family or liege negotiated his release for a hefty sum. In some cases, prisoners of noble birth were treated almost like honored guests, fed decently, and even allowed some freedoms, all because their captors stood to profit. Yet even this depended on fortune. A knight might be ransomed if he was recognized and valued, but if he fell into the wrong hands, he might be killed outright in the chaos before his worth was realized. For common soldiers, the story was far bleaker. Few peasants could afford ransom, and few lords would pay it on their behalf. Capturing a poor soldier brought no reward, and so mercy was rarely extended. Many were cut down on the spot, slain where they stood even after dropping their weapons. Others were taken as prisoners not for ransom, but for use as slaves or forced laborers, marched away from the battlefield to toil in chains. A life of captivity awaited those unlucky enough to be spared, and in many cases this was a crueler fate than death. The brutality of prisoners' treatment was not limited to enslavement. Executions were common, especially if the victors wanted to send a message. Defeated soldiers might be lined up and beheaded, hanged, or mutilated as a warning to others. In some wars, entire groups of captives were slaughtered in cold blood because feeding and guarding them was seen as too great a burden. The battlefield was not a place of compassion. It was a place where practicality and cruelty often went hand in hand. Even the promise of mercy was often a trap. Some commanders encouraged enemies to surrender with assurances of safety, only to slaughter them once they laid down their arms. In the confusion of combat, distinctions between surrendering and fighting soldiers were blurred, and few victors paused to ask questions. Rage, exhaustion, and bloodlust drove men to kill without hesitation. Once swords were swinging, there was little room for restraint. Those who fell to their knees, hands raised, were often cut down just as quickly as those who continued to resist. The treatment of prisoners also depended heavily on the culture and time period. In some regions, codes of chivalry encouraged sparing noble opponents, but even these ideals were often ignored in the heat of battle. In others, religious fervor or deep-seated hatred turned wars into massacres, where mercy was considered weakness. Crusades in particular brought out extremes of brutality, with captured enemies slaughtered en masse as acts of vengeance or as supposed service to God. Ideals of honor collapsed easily in the face of hatred, hunger, and rage. For the prisoner himself, the psychological torment was immense. To be captured was to be stripped of all agency, left at the mercy of men who had every reason to see you as worthless or dangerous. Some captives begged desperately, offering loyalty, money, or service. Others resigned themselves to their fate, silent and hollow-eyed as they awaited death or enslavement. The uncertainty itself was torture, never knowing if the next moment would bring execution, imprisonment, or some faint chance of survival. Those who survived captivity often faced years of hardship. Nobles ransomed back to their families might live, but they carried the humiliation of defeat, sometimes ending their careers or reputations. Commoners enslaved were ripped from their homes, never to return. Families never knew what became of them, left to wonder if their loved ones had been killed or were still alive in chains far from home. Survival, in this sense, was not freedom, but another form of death, the death of one's former life. The brutality of prisoner treatment was not simply cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was born of practicality, greed, and vengeance. Armies did not have the resources to feed thousands of captives, so they slaughtered them instead. Soldiers wanted profit, so they spared only those who could pay. Hatred fueled by propaganda or faith justified slaughter in the minds of the victors. The battlefield was not a place of fairness. It was a place where power dictated life and death, and mercy was the rare exception. For the modern imagination, the idea of surrender carries hope. But in the Middle Ages, surrender often carried none. To drop your sword was not to save your life, but to gamble it, and the odds were rarely in your favor. On a medieval battlefield, to be captured was to step into a world of uncertainty, cruelty, and exploitation. Whether you died quickly by the sword, lingered in chains, or were sold into slavery, survival was never truly assured. And that is why prisoners were often no more fortunate than the slain, for mercy was a rarity and brutality the rule. When the clash of steel finally subsided when the shouting dwindled, and when the last cavalry charge broke apart into silence, the battlefield did not suddenly transform into peace. The aftermath of a medieval battle was a world of horror all its own, a place where death lingered in every corner and survival remained uncertain, even for those who had endured the fight itself. Victory did not mean safety, and defeat did not always mean a swift end. What remained after battle was a landscape of corpses, suffering, and despair that few could truly comprehend without seeing it themselves. The field itself was transformed into a grotesque wasteland. Bodies carpeted the ground, often piled upon one another where the fighting had been thickest. Blood pooled in the mud, staining the earth black and sticky. Weapons lay scattered, shields splintered, banners torn and trampled. The air stank of iron, sweat, and decay, the smell of death already beginning to rise as the sun warmed the fallen. For survivors stumbling through this scene, the sight was overwhelming. They had fought among comrades, and now those comrades lay lifeless at their feet, their faces twisted in fear, pain, or blank stillness. The cries of the wounded pierced the silence. Not all who fell died instantly. Many lay writhing in agony, clutching at wounds, begging for water, crying for mothers, wives, or God. Some had limbs crushed beyond saving. Others had arrows lodged deep within their bodies, and still others lay slowly bleeding out. Their screams carried across the battlefield long after the fighting was done, echoing into the night as survivors listened helplessly. There were too many to aid, too few hands to help, and too little knowledge to save them. Most were left where they lay, their voices fading hour by hour until silence claimed them at last. Scavengers arrived quickly. Some were human camp followers, looters, or desperate peasants from nearby villages who slipped onto the field to strip the dead of armor, weapons, boots, or even clothing. They worked swiftly, often before the corpses were cold, prying rings from fingers, cutting belts from waists, or tearing food from the pouches of the fallen. Others were animals' crows circling overhead, dogs skulking at the edges, and in time, wolves or wild boars drawn by the scent of blood. The battlefield was not a sacred place of honor, but a feast for those who lived off the dead. For soldiers who survived, watching comrades stripped or mauled was a final humiliation, as if even death gave no peace. Disease followed swiftly. With so many bodies left unburied, the stench of rot filled the air within days. Flies swarmed, spreading infection, while rivers and wells became contaminated by the blood and waste of thousands. Survivors who lingered too long often fell ill, carried off by fevers or dysentery in the days after battle. The camp of the victors became no safer than the battlefield itself, as sickness spread through weakened, exhausted men. Many who thought they had escaped death in combat found themselves dying slowly in the aftermath. The victors often celebrated, but even celebration was tinged with cruelty. They looted the dead, executed prisoners, or burned villages nearby. Drunken revelry mingled with the moans of the wounded, creating a scene of disturbing contrast. For the defeated, the aftermath was worse still. Survivors were hunted down, enslaved, or slaughtered. Families searched for fathers, brothers, and sons, only to find their bodies broken in the dirt. The aftermath of battle did not distinguish between winners and losers. It crushed both beneath its weight. Psychologically, the survivors bore scars that never faded. They carried with them the memory of the screams, the stench of rot, and the sight of friends dying slowly around them. Some walked the battlefield afterward, searching among the corpses for familiar faces, each discovery breaking them further. Others could not bring themselves to look at all, turning away from the horror even as it haunted their dreams. Victory brought no comfort to men who had seen so much suffering. Burials, when they happened, were hasty. Mass graves were dug, bodies thrown together without ceremony. Priests sometimes walked among the fallen, offering prayers, but there was rarely time for dignity. The dead were too many, and the living too few to bury them properly. In some cases, corpses were left to rot where they lay, their bones whitening under the sun for years to come. Travelers passing battlefields, long after the fighting, could still see skulls and armor scattered across the ground, grim reminders of what had transpired. For nearby villages, the aftermath was disastrous. Fields were ruined, livestock stolen, homes burned, and disease spread into their communities. Survivors of battle often turned to pillage, desperate for food or drink, preying on the same peasants who had no part in the fighting. War left scars not only on soldiers, but on the land and the people who lived upon it, scars that lasted for generations. To survive the battle was not enough. One had to survive the aftermath, with its hunger, its sickness, and its despair. Many soldiers who thought they had endured the worst found themselves undone by what followed. A wound untreated, a fever caught from the camp, a misstep among corpses. These were the quiet killers that claimed lives after swords had been sheathed. The battlefield's cruelty did not end when the fighting stopped. It lingered in every cry, every smell, every sight of the broken ground. The truth of medieval warfare is that the battle itself was only one part of the ordeal. The aftermath was often just as deadly, just as horrifying, and just as impossible to endure. Survival meant walking away from the field, but it also meant carrying the weight of what you had seen, smelled, and heard. And for many, that weight was too heavy to bear. To live after a medieval battle was not to escape it, but to be bound to it forever, haunted by the ghosts of the field long after the noise of combat had faded away. When the clash of weapons ended and the banners of one side fell, what followed was not peace, but a different kind of violence. Victory often unleashed the darker instincts of soldiers, who, exhausted and hungry, turned to looting and pillaging as both reward and survival. The battlefield and the villages nearby became scenes of plunder, where the defeated were stripped of everything: armor, food, livestock, and even dignity. For those who thought survival meant outlasting the battle, the horror of looting and pillaging proved that death was not the only fate to fear. Looting began on the battlefield itself. As soon as the fighting ceased, survivors combed the ground for valuables. The dead and dying were stripped of weapons, armor, boots, and clothing. Even a simple knife or a pair of sturdy shoes was worth taking, and soldiers scavenged without hesitation. A knight's body was a treasure chest, his sword, his mail, his rings, all ripe for the taking. Comrades who had fought side by side only hours earlier were sometimes robbed of possessions by their own allies, the bonds of fellowship dissolving in the scramble for spoils. For the wounded, still breathing but helpless on the ground, looting was a fresh humiliation. They were stripped bare, left naked and shivering, sometimes finished off with a quick thrust so their belongings could be taken without protest. Once the field was picked clean, the victors often turned their attention to nearby settlements. Villages close to the battlefield paid the heaviest price. Soldiers poured in, searching for food, wine, and shelter. Doors were broken down, granaries emptied, and livestock driven away. Homes were ransacked, their possessions stolen or destroyed. Peasants who resisted were beaten, tortured, or killed outright. Women bore a particular burden, as rape was an all too common weapon of pillaging. The chaos of victory provided cover for such crimes, and the powerless villagers had little chance of defense. To the soldiers, this was not cruelty for its own sake, it was survival and reward. Armies were rarely paid well, if at all. Many soldiers relied on plunder as their primary means of compensation. Commanders sometimes encouraged looting as a way to satisfy their men and keep discipline from breaking entirely. In other cases, they turned a blind eye, knowing they could not stop thousands of desperate soldiers from taking what they wanted. To the victors, pillaging was a right. To the defeated, it was devastation. The brutality of looting left scars that lasted long after armies moved on. Villages were left destitute, their stores of food gone, their homes destroyed, their families broken. Survivors faced famine, disease, and poverty, struggling to rebuild from the ashes of war. Children grew up remembering the day soldiers stormed through their homes, carrying away their fathers or brutalizing their mothers. The wounds of pillaging were not only physical, but generational, leaving behind trauma that echoed for decades. The battlefield itself became a strange market of sorts. Looters sold or traded what they found, armor torn from corpses, jewelry pried from fingers, even weapons still slick with blood. Black markets flourished around war, where scavenged goods made their way into new hands. For some, looting became a profession, with scavengers following armies from place to place, ready to descend on the dead like vultures once the fighting was done. These camp followers were often as feared as the soldiers themselves, for they stripped the battlefield clean with ruthless efficiency. There was also a religious and moral dimension to pillaging. Priests sometimes condemned looting, calling it sinful, but their words often went unheard amid the chaos. In certain campaigns, particularly those waged under the banner of holy war, pillaging was justified as God's will. Entire cities were looted and burned, their treasures taken as proof of divine favor. Whether condemned or sanctified, the practice continued, for hunger and greed proved stronger than ideals. The psychological effect of looting was heavy on both sides. Victors hardened themselves to the cries of peasants and comrades alike, telling themselves that plunder was their due. Yet some carried guilt afterward, haunted by the memory of faces they had robbed or families they had ruined. For the victims, the trauma was immediate and enduring. To watch helplessly as strangers stripped away everything you owned, to be powerless as your life's work vanished in a moment, left scars that no rebuilding could erase. For the common soldier, looting was both temptation and necessity. Hunger gnawed constantly, and the promise of food or coin was irresistible. But it also revealed the brutal truth of medieval war. Survival often came at the expense of others. A soldier's strength was built on stolen bread, his warmth on stolen clothes, his comfort on stolen shelter. To live another day, he had to take from someone else, and in the unforgiving world of the battlefield, pity was a luxury few could afford. The reality of medieval warfare was that victory was not the end of suffering. It was only the beginning of another ordeal, one inflicted on the powerless by the powerful. Looting and pillaging ensured that war's reach extended beyond the soldiers who fought into the lives of every villager, every farmer, every family in its path. To survive the battlefield was one thing. To survive its aftermath, when victors became predators, was another challenge altogether. For most, there was no survival at all, only loss, ruin, and despair, carried forward long after the soldiers marched away. If swords, arrows, and lances brought swift death, then disease brought slow, lingering devastation. The medieval battlefield was not only a place of immediate violence, it was a breeding ground for sickness. Wherever thousands of men gathered in close quarters, with poor sanitation, bad food, and rotting corpses all around, disease flourished. Long after the fighting ended, it spread through camps, villages, and towns, claiming more lives than the weapons ever did. To survive a medieval battle was only to face the next invisible enemy, illness. The most immediate sources of disease were the bodies of the dead and wounded. After a battle, corpses lay in heaps, sometimes unburied for days or even weeks. Blood soaked the ground, and the heat of the sun quickened decay. The smell of rot filled the air, carrying swarms of flies that landed on both corpses and living men, spreading infection from wound to wound. Rats scurried among the bodies, feeding and carrying fleas into camps. For the survivors, walking the field meant stepping among contagion, breathing it in with every foul breath. One of the most feared consequences of the battlefield was the outbreak of dysentery, known at the time as the flux. This illness spread quickly in unsanitary camps, where water was fouled by waste, blood, and rotting flesh. Soldiers weakened by hunger and exhaustion were especially vulnerable. Dysentery brought violent diarrhea, dehydration, and eventually death. Entire companies were laid low not by the enemy's steel, but by hours spent writhing in agony, their strength drained until they could not even stand. Other fevers swept through armies as well. Typhus, carried by lice, was common in the filthy, crowded conditions of medieval war. Symptoms included high fever, rash, and delirium. And once it took hold, it spread like fire through ranks of soldiers who slept packed tightly in tents. Malaria thrived in marshy regions, striking down men who camped near stagnant water. Pneumonia and influenza-like illnesses appeared in the colder seasons, spreading swiftly through exhausted troops. Even wounds that might have seemed survivable often became infected, turning into festering sores that led to tetanus, gangrene, or blood poisoning. Plague itself, most famously the Black Death, was closely tied to the movement of armies. Soldiers carried fleas and rats with them wherever they marched, spreading infection from one region to another. In times of outbreak, an army could collapse without a single battle being fought. Villages unlucky enough to be caught between opposing forces often suffered double, the violence of the armies and the sickness they brought in their wake. For civilians, soldiers were as much carriers of death through disease as they were through the sword. The psychological toll of these invisible killers was immense. Soldiers who had endured the terror of combat now faced the dread of watching comrades fall ill one by one. Camps filled with the groans of the sick, their bodies trembling with fever, their skin blotched or yellowed. Fear spread as men realized that no blade could be raised against this enemy, no shield could defend against it. Strong men who had stood firm against cavalry charges collapsed in their beds, helpless as children. The uncertainty was terrifying. Any meal, any sip of water, any flea bite could bring death. Medicine offered little help. Physicians still believed disease came from bad air or imbalance of the humors. Treatments included bleeding, purging, or burning herbs to cleanse the air, none of which stopped the spread. Prayers and charms were common, but even faith seemed fragile when entire companies withered away. Soldiers often turned to superstition, blaming witches, curses, or the wrath of God. In such despair, morale collapsed, and armies dissolved as men fled in terror of illness rather than of the enemy. Civilians caught in the aftermath of battles suffered equally. Fields were poisoned by corpses, rivers contaminated, and villages stripped of food. With no way to clean up the mess left behind, communities fell ill, their people struck down by fevers long after soldiers had marched away. Mothers, children, and the elderly perished in numbers equal to the fighters themselves, proving that the battlefield's reach extended far beyond the clash of armies. The cycle of disease ensured that survival was a fleeting hope. A soldier might endure the march, the hunger, the arrows, the clash of steel, and even the aftermath of looting, only to die days later of fever. Death from sickness was often slower, crueler, and more despairing than death in battle. A man might watch his comrades die one by one, knowing his turn would come, with no weapon to defend himself and no hope of cure. For many, this was worse than the terror of combat itself. The truth is that disease killed far more soldiers than swords ever did. Wars were decided not only on the field, but in the camps, where illness decimated armies silently and without glory. To imagine surviving a medieval battlefield without falling victim to disease is to imagine an unlikely stroke of fortune. For most, survival was temporary, and sickness waited patiently in the shadows. The battlefield did not end with the last clash of arms. It lived on in the fevers, fluxes, and plagues that swept through the living, claiming them just as surely as any blade. When we look back on the Middle Ages, it is tempting to picture shining knights riding into battle, their banners fluttering in the wind, remembered forever for their valor. Chronicles speak of heroes, ballads praise noble deeds, and later generations imagined war as a stage for honor and glory. But for the men who actually stood on medieval battlefields, glory was rare, if it existed at all. For every knight sung about in stories, there were thousands of nameless soldiers who died in the mud, their bodies left to rot, their names forgotten even by their own families. The idea of glory was little more than a thin veil stretched over the grim reality of war. The promise of glory was often a lure to recruit men into service. Lords spoke of honor, duty, and the rewards of bravery, while priests preached of divine favor and eternal salvation for those who fought under holy banners. Young men, eager for recognition, believed that war might lift them from obscurity. They dreamed of returning home with tales of valor, their names etched into memory. But once they stepped onto the battlefield, those dreams withered quickly. There was no stage, no song, only the chaos of mud, steel, blood, and fear. The overwhelming majority found not honor, but anonymous death. Even for the knights who were celebrated, glory came at a terrible cost. To be remembered for bravery often meant charging into impossible danger, standing one's ground against overwhelming odds, or sacrificing oneself so that others might escape. Many who performed such deeds did not live to hear their praises sung. Their glory existed only in the words of others, while they themselves were buried beneath the same earth as the forgotten masses. And sometimes the tales of glory were exaggerations or inventions, created by chroniclers who sought to flatter patrons rather than record truth. The lived experience of the knight was pain, exhaustion, and fear not shining triumph. For the common soldier, glory was virtually impossible. Their deaths went unrecorded, their bravery unnoticed. A peasant pressed into service who fought bravely might save comrades' lives, but when he fell, he was simply one among many. Families might never even know where or how he died, his body left among countless others. In the scale of medieval warfare, individuals blurred into the faceless mass of the fallen. Survival meant returning home quietly, not celebrated as a hero, but simply grateful to still breathe. The battlefield itself destroyed any illusion of honor. Glory imagined clean duels between worthy foes, yet real combat was far messier. A knight's armor might save him from an equal opponent, but he could be dragged down by 3 desperate foot soldiers with knives. Arrows struck men unseen, ending lives before a single blow was exchanged. Cavalry charges trampled not just enemies but comrades. Disease and starvation killed far more than heroism ever saved. In such conditions, the idea of a noble, glorious death was little more than fantasy. Even victors rarely felt glory. Surviving a battle did not mean standing proudly over the fallen with banners raised high. It meant stumbling through the carnage, sickened by the cries of the wounded, stripped of comrades, haunted by the sights of mutilated bodies. Victory often came at such cost that it felt like loss. Whole villages lay in ruins, fields destroyed, and families broken. Survivors carried wounds that never healed, both on their bodies and in their minds. Glory, if it existed, was buried under layers of grief and trauma. Religion promised heavenly reward, yet even here glory was uncertain. Some priests preached that dying in battle for one's lord or faith brought salvation. Others warned that killing, no matter the reason, risked eternal damnation. Soldiers marched under banners of the cross or the crescent, convinced they fought for God. But the battlefield's horrors often left them doubting whether God was truly on their side. Whatever spiritual comfort was offered often failed to mask the brutality they endured. The stories of glory that survived were selective. Chroniclers focused on kings, nobles, and great battles, not on the countless smaller skirmishes or forgotten deaths. They wrote to impress patrons, to inspire loyalty, or to craft legends. Glory was preserved in ink and song, but only for a privileged few. For the vast majority, the battlefield ended in silence, their struggles erased from memory. History remembers Agincourt, Hastings, and Poitiers, but it does not remember the names of the ordinary men who perished there. In truth, medieval warfare was not about glory, but about survival, and survival was rare. Those who lived often returned home broken, scarred, or impoverished. Few were rewarded handsomely, and many were abandoned once they were no longer useful. Glory, then, was a story told afterward, not the reality lived in the mud, blood, and chaos of combat. To imagine standing on a medieval battlefield and hoping for glory is to imagine standing in the midst of death and despair, expecting beauty. What you would find instead was horror, exhaustion, and anonymity. Glory was the exception, not the rule, and for most, the battlefield offered nothing but suffering, loss, and oblivion. You have now walked with me through the brutal world of the medieval battlefield. Together, we traced the long march that drained men before they even arrived at the fight. We stepped into the suffocating press of combat, where armor weighed heavy, arrows rained from the sky, and confusion made enemies of friends. We lingered in the aftermath, where the dead lay unburied, the wounded cried out without hope of healing, and disease carried away survivors who thought they had escaped. And finally, we saw how little glory there truly was, how most men perished nameless, their sacrifices forgotten beneath layers of mud, blood, and silence. The truth is stark. A medieval battlefield was not a place for survival. It was an environment designed to break the body, overwhelm the mind, and erase the individual in a storm of chaos. Few left unscathed, and even those who did bore scars both visible and invisible. What seems distant to us now, painted in legends and romanticized in teles, was for those who lived it a nightmare that ended too often in misery. Survival was not a mark of strength, but a gift of luck, granted rarely and withdrawn swiftly. As you settle into rest tonight, let these images fade into something softer. Think not of the clash of war, but of the quiet lessons it leaves behind. That human beings, no matter the age, have always faced trials greater than themselves. That survival was never guaranteed. And that, in remembering the past, we honor those countless forgotten lives. History is not only glory and triumph, it is also the quiet suffering of those who endured. Before you drift into sleep, I invite you once more to support this journey through history. Subscribe to History for Sleep if you have not already, so you can return whenever you seek calm storytelling to ease the night. Leave a comment to share what periods of history interest you most, or when you listen, whether at bedtime, while studying, or in moments when you simply want to unwind. Your thoughts guide us, and your presence keeps this space alive. Thank you for joining me on this long path across the medieval battlefield. May the echoes of the past soothe you now, carrying you gently away from the chaos of history and into the peace of rest. Sleep well, and let tomorrow come quietly.